So this is amp number 5 in my history and definitely one of my favorites. This is I think a 1984 Marshall JCM 800 lead series 50 watt single channel head that had for the US the 6550 tubes instead of the EL34s in the power section. So instead of two EL34s, it had two 6550s. Anyway, this amp's pretty much identical to the one that I owned. Um, the guy at the guitar shop, after I traded, well, when I wanted to trade in my Reverb 75, suggested I get the single channel one instead of the dual channel. He said they sound better. Um, I took his word for it. I liked the simplicity of it. Um, One of the things about this amp was that by itself, if you turn the preamp, which is right here, well, you had a preamp and a master volume, and you turn the preamp all the way up, it would max out the amount of distortion coming from the preamp. It wasn't enough. It was good, but for some of the music that I was playing, if I was playing Judas Priest or Van Halen or stuff like that, especially because I was doing a lot of live shows, didn't quite get enough gain. And I found out later that a lot of people were taking these to the shop, to various, guys that would modify these preamps and maybe add an extra preamp tube, so on and so forth, to get more distortion out of the preamp. Well, at the time, I had several Boss effects in a little box, and one of them was a Graphic EQ GE7. I don't even remember why I bought it. I just wanted to be able to kind of tweak around the tone. Anyway, I found out, because everything was running into the front end of this amp, because those amps at the time did not have an effects loop, okay? And I thought, well, what if I turn up the level for my guitar going into the amp? So the Boss GE7 had a level control, so I would crank up the overall level control of the sound going into the amp, from the signal rather, from the guitar going to the amp, and voila, I had as much distortion as I wanted. In fact, I could only turn it up to a certain point, and it started to sound muddy. So I kind of found the sweet spot where it sounded really good, and it was like modding the Marshall without modding it. I didn't use any overdrive pedals in front of it. I just used that, and it kept the tone pure, kept it clean. Found out later that Kerry King was doing something similar. Kerry King from Slayer, with his Marshalls. I think he was using an MXR graphic equalizer in front of his, to jack up the signal and jack up the mids going into the amp. So I did something similar to what he did, and it's just kind of a trial and error thing. A lot of things that we do, especially in those days, back in the 80s, was trial and error. Just try this, see if it makes it sound better, and that's what I did. Anyway, the amp was massively loud. If the master volume, I could rarely crank it anywhere past maybe one or two, and it was ridiculously loud. And that was with any gig that I played. It had a very touchy master volume. Great, great, great rock heavy metal amplifier, one of the best I ever had. My sound man was constantly complaining about how much low end it kicked out through the cabinet, and he was constantly complaining about that. And but it sounds so good. So I eventually traded it in for a combo amp to get him to stop complaining, and it was one of the worst decisions I ever made. I really loved that amp, and so anyway, I have more Marshall heads now, so that kind of makes up for it. But I really missed that amp after I got rid of it. It was one of the amps that I loved more than anything, and then obviously find out later that a huge percentage of hard rock and heavy metal that was recorded in the 80s on a lot of the biggest records biggest selling records at the time were recorded using this amplifier or versions of it. The back of it, I'll show you, had this big metal screen. Real simple, you know, just it's really simple straight ahead amplifier. Not a lot of to do going on. There's a shot here that shows the interior. Here's the tubes. So these are, for some reason, Marshall put 6550 tubes instead of EL34s. Maybe it was a supply thing at the time, but they were similar to 6L6s, and it was super, super loud. And these are the caps. Those are capacitors. The original ones were probably blue because mine had blue ones. Those giant capacitors. I always wondered what the hell those things were. Anyway, so there you go. JCM 800, a classic, and I was one of the lucky people to own and perform and record with one.